Issa? Yes. Issa Galloway.
Issa Galloway defines the mission.
Welcome to Ramadan Recap, where in about 10 minutes we break down the most impactful news stories of the day so you don't have to. Getting straight into our first story. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has apparently been working to find the power to revoke visas for quite some time. In fact, in 2023, lo and behold, it was the Biden administration to confirm that a Secretary of State could do just that. Now, why does this matter? This is yet another example of Democrats helping get us to the place we are in this moment. And then now that we're here, acting in, I would say, maybe in a performative way to be like, oh, we have to resist this. Guys, this is crazy. And it's a theme that I want you to keep in the back of your head as we go through the rest of the episode. In the next story, Trump's economic warfare on American universities seems to be working and bearing fruit, causing universities to abandon the First Amendment and even academic freedom. In fact, this week, DHS went to Columbia University to serve 2 warrants. ICE arrested a Palestinian student from the West Bank for overstaying her visa, and the Trump administration revoked the visa of an Indian citizen and doctoral student at Columbia, accused that person of supporting Hamas, and they happened to opt out of the whole process by choosing quote unquote self-deportation using the CBP app called the Home app. Hours before all this happened, though, the Trump administration reached out to Columbia, kind of teasing the ability to get their funding restored, the funding that the Trump administration withheld in the first place. But they'd have to do a few things. And one is to address, and this is a quote, anti-Zionist discrimination, and expel the students behind the now infamous Hens Hall protest. Columbia has done that, by the way. Following up on the arrest and the self-deportation, Columbia canceled a bargaining session with the Graduate Student Union just 2 hours before it was to begin. Now, what's so interesting about that is it comes right after Harvard law students' body passed a divestment referendum with a whopping 73% support. Now, commenting on the arrest and self-deportation at Columbia, United States Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, said, "It is a privilege to be granted a visa and live and study in the United States. When you advocate for violence and terrorism, that privilege should be revoked, and you should not be in this country." Now, on the surface, kind of putting aside the First Amendment privileges, it sounds like a reasonable statement. But let's just keep in mind why it actually matters. Academic freedom is at risk. Universities should be safe places. But for me, a safe place isn't what a lot of what, the left or what people would call the libs of TikTok would describe it. I would say they should be safe spaces from, violence, threats, and intimidation, but not safe from having challenging ideas or being challenged on your beliefs. That's kind of what university is all about. And this is what makes America actually great: our free speech, our ability to debate while having civil discourse and not divulging into violence. And not to mention attracting the best and brightest from around the world to our shores through our universities. The next story is related to Harvard and I think exposes a lot of hypocrisy. A former Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, joked to hundreds of people about sending pagers, hint, hint, nod, nod, explosive devices to the dissenting people at the event, which was a talk at Harvard Business School. And it was this Thursday that it happened. Now, this is clearly a case of free speech for me and not for thee. And the double standard is that a visiting foreign national is afforded the ability to talk about violence and make terroristic threats, but not for permanent residents or other students? And what about for opinionated Americans? I'm really kind of waiting for the America First people to kind of chime in and take this issue seriously. The next story remains at Ivy League universities. This is at Yale University, who suspended, and I'm probably going to butcher this name, but bear with me, Dr. Dow Taghi, after an AI-generated article from an outlet called The Jewish Onliner accused her of terror ties. I have to repeat this. This is an AI article. It began to spread online, and she woke up to messages from Yale Law School demanding that she come in for questioning. Now, let me just show you how crazy this is, because not only has the professor been suspended, but this all went down apparently on Thursday. So I Googled the professor, and when you click on her Yale profile, since Thursday, this has been what you will find. So essentially, there already have distance themselves from her. Now, why does this matter? It's more than just the one person, right? This matters because we're already had seen how the Trump administration released plans to use artificial intelligence to comb through and search people's social media as part of those deportation efforts, especially aimed at students. Well, this is a voluntary removal of an academic faculty from Yale just based on a so-called news site. I repeat, this was not the government telling Yale that Dr. Dautaghi was a problem. This is a preemptive event of self-harm to their own faculty to avoid having to defend or push back against the administration for academic freedom. It's a travesty, y'all. Now, the next story goes on a tradition that we started to establish on this show, and that is to feature the many, many Jewish voices who are advocating both for an end to the genocide and to protect free speech. I want us to be very cognizant to never sweep all groups of people under one bus or think that people are monolithic. The Jewish Voice for Peace protest at Trump Towers kind of shows the news trying to hide the Jewish identity of the protesters from the public. Now, guys, I want you to understand propaganda can be as much about lies being told to you as well as lies of omission or what you're not being told. Now, to do that, let's take a look at protest in Trump Tower. Top stories. The AP right here is the standout that does say Jewish protesters flooded Trump Tower lobby to demand Mahmoud Khalil's apparently release. I didn't click on it. The thing here is I want us to pay attention to the focus on the individual, Mahmoud Khalil. Now, this is a problem when you're advocating for a cause. This is a very common PR and propaganda technique to take it off of the value of free speech and academic freedom and take it to an individual's plight. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if it does come out that Khalil had some unsavory or illegal activities, so far that remains to be seen. But if it becomes an issue where they can even just tarnish him falsely, then the cause for academic freedom and for freedom of speech is tarnished by the personalization of these protests, because they're there supporting, yes, him, but in a larger sense, supporting freedom of speech and academic freedom. And the news does this repeatedly. So not only do only the AP mention the Jewish identity of the protesters, look at NBC News. Nearly 100 protesters arrested after sit-in at Trump Tower in New York City to demand release of, going back to Mahmoud. Protesters supporting Mahmoud Khalil occupy Trump Tower. That's Fox News. They use the word occupy on purpose to harken back to Occupy Wall Street. Protesters occupy Trump Tower following arrest of Columbia student. Again, they didn't put it to the person of Mahmoud Khalil, but they put it to an individual student. At least that's kind of hinting towards the idea of academic freedom. Fox 5 in New York says Trump Tower protesters, 150 Mahmoud Khalil supporters storm Midtown building, not even mentioning that it was Trump Tower. And then CNN, not much better, protesters arrested after storming Trump Tower to demand release of Mahmoud. And then it just goes on and on. So one out of all of these news sites talks about the Jewish identity of the protesters. Well, luckily for us, there is such a thing as social media, and this is Facebook, not TikTok, but Jewish Voice for Peace actually, self-documented their action so that there could be no denial of who was behind it, which again, I think is something that our channel and more news needs to be cognizant of and call out. We got to get into the next story, which is President Trump literally declaring that Chuck Schumer is no longer Jewish. I'm not kidding y'all. Now, this is incredibly ironic because the Trump team negotiating, which is an unprecedented move, directly with the terrorist organization Hamas. Both of Trump's people, Adam Buller and Steve Witkoff, are having their Jewishness questioned by Trump allies at the exact same time that Trump himself is declaring Senate leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat leader Chuck Schumer, not to be a Jew anymore and to be a Palestinian, as if being a Palestinian is a slur. Now, why does this matter, guys? I think it's kind of obvious, but when an authoritarian who is not Jewish can speak like this openly about a Jewish elected official, and there's little to any pushback from the so-called anti-Semitism orgs or prominent, conservative Jewish leaders like your Ben Shapiro's. Like take the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, for instance. They defended Elon Musk's Nazi salutes, right? And they had backed the Trump administration pretty sweepingly on a lot of things. And then they issued in response to this weak sauce statement calling Trump's remarks beneath that of any POTUS, our president of the United States. Well, at the very least, what we can learn from this is a lesson on how to lose your credibility as a civil rights organization. Guys, this is getting to unprecedented moves. More on like backlash against Jewish Americans for opposing the administration is this story here with Judge Jesse Furman, a Jewish American who halted the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, again, the Columbia student. And I need to kind of explain the legal grounds that the Columbia student, Mahmoud, is being deported on. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, is trying to say that the deportation and revocation of his permanent resident status and green card are rooted in his authority because he's saying that the activism and the voice of Khalil is a threat to U.S. foreign policy interests. Guys, this is craziness because you have that happening. And while the judge halted the deportation, you have Laura Loomer, one of the Trump big advocates before the election, also seemingly to be a very noted anti-Semite, is out attacking the Jewishness of the judge and his family. Now, to say this at its simplest terms, if U.S. foreign policy is vulnerable to a grad student at Columbia, and that kind of action and activism, then perhaps maybe that foreign policy item is unpopular with the electorate. Or maybe, and even more importantly, this is a misuse of a wartime law. We'll have more on that in just a moment. Moving to the next story is more president versus federal court drama. President Trump is now asking the Supreme Court of the U.S. to allow just some revoking of birthright citizenships. I guess this is Trump's just the tip moment. The Trump administration wants the justices to allow Trump's plan to go into effect for everyone except for the handful of people in the group that sued him, arguing that states lack the legal right or standing to challenge the executive order. Now, as a fallback, the administration is asking, at a minimum, to be allowed to make public announcements about the plan to revoke birthright citizenship, so that once the policy is eventually allowed to take effect, that people know it. And what's crazy about this is it demonstrates that legal challenges to the Trump administration are still effective, at least for now. Recognizing the authority of the court, the Trump administration is acting within the legal system at the moment. But the next story actually is showing that that could be at a breaking point because U.S. District Judge John McConnell issued a nationwide injunction blocking the Trump administration's federal funding freeze and attempting to reestablish the Congress's power of the purse, or basically how our government and its checks and balances system is supposed to work. In response to this, though, Elon Musk retweeted a statement that activist judges should be impeached. And what we've seen from this administration a lot is that surrogates or Musk himself or other people are out there kind of telegraphing the next move to build public support. And that's what this tweet seems to be all about. Now, getting towards the tail end of the episode, a couple of our last stories are very, very important. This one is a UN report accusing Israel of sexual violence and genocidal acts in Gaza. The report was commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council, and it documents alleged violations, including rape in Gaza and the occupied West Banks since Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel triggered the genocide. It also says, and this is key, the destruction of maternity wards in Gaza and embryos at a fertility clinic could indicate a strategy to prevent births amongst a particular group. In this case, that group is Palestinians. And this is one of the legal definitions of genocide. Now, obviously, this matters for a number of things, but the sexual violence story regarding Gaza that gets little to no attention is the sexual violence happening against Palestinians. And it doesn't get any attention because it doesn't serve the cause of dehumanizing Palestinians. Keep that in mind as you hear more and more from the region. Now, in more patrolling of speech about Israel, the Miami Beach mayor, Stephen Miner, is proposing to terminate a lease agreement and discontinue thousands of dollars in financial support for a group called O Cinema, an independent film theater, just because it screened the Oscar award-winning documentary No Other Land. He called the film, and this is a direct quote, a false one-sided propaganda attack on the Jewish people that is not consistent with the values of our city and residents. Now, There's so much to say here, but the quick and dirty about why this matters is it is a counter to the argument used against anti-genocide protesters at the local level. Often what happens is there's an excuse saying to dismiss the genocide, the people protesting genocide, and dismiss them, saying, you're seeking a ceasefire resolution, but what use is that? Because foreign policy, it has nothing to do with us. We're a city, we're a state, we're a township, right? This mayor and Houston's mayor are proving that foreign policy does in fact matter to them and that they do not serve all their constituents equally. Now, getting to the next story, it looks like a government shutdown is going to be avoided back on Friday. Basically Democrats handling a political victory to President Trump. Now, let's get into why this matters. They started, the Democrats, using a legal maneuver called cloture. And I want you to see the names of the 10 Democrats who caucused together and voted yes, invoking this legal maneuver. These 10 people are the exact same 10 people who voted for the Trump-backed GOP funding bill, thus avoiding the government shutdown. Here is Chuck Schumer, and here are the same people. Some of the usual suspects, of course, are John Fetterman, Kristen Gillibrand. You do see a couple other people like, where is it? Dick Durbin of Illinois. So all of these people are basically letting you know who the GOP's Senate Democrat collaborators are. And I want to give a special shout out to Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, who was the only Republican who voted against invoking cloture and funding the bill. Now, he did it on a different set of principles, as he has long been against increases in government funding for his entire career. But just as the Trump administration is now going after Thomas Massie, let's see if they go after Rand Paul as well. Getting to the next story, speaking of Democrats leading, this story should open our eyes to the predicament that the First Amendment is in right now, as only 14 congresspeople signed a letter calling for the release of Mahmoud Khalil. And you have to understand that this is such a minority because House members, there's so much more of them. There's 100 senators, 2 for each state. But I don't know the exact number of people in the House, but I know it's well over 300. And if you can only get 14 people to sign up for free speech protections, it's kind of an insane indictment on where we're at as a country. The next story is related to this because the Trump administration is enacting a 1970s law, which is called the Alien Enemies, for basically detention and deportation. Now, this is the only 4th time in American history that a president has used the act, and the first time since World War II. Now, keep that in mind. We said earlier we're going to be talking about misusing a wartime law. Well, this is it. The directive targets members of Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan prison gang famous for, in my neck of the woods in Colorado, for reportedly taking over an apartment complex. But the authorities have expedited removal of all Venezuelan citizens 14 and older deemed to be members of the organization under this wartime law. They are not U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents, differentiating them from Mahmoud Khalil. However, there's nothing and this is a direct quote from Catherine von Ebright, who is the Council on Liberty and National Security at the Brennan Center for Justice. She says there's nothing in the law itself that would require it to be limited to undocumented individuals or individuals who have committed crimes. Now, she's basically making the case, and this is to continue von Ebright's quote. Again, she's with the left of center, Brennan for Justice Center. It is not about legal status, consistent with the idea that it's a wartime authority and not an immigration authority, meaning that this is a law being misused and being used at a time of peace for immigration purposes, not for its intent on keeping American security heightened during a war. Now, the trend from the Trump administration is to use this law or to use any type of law or action on a group that it can justify it on and then expand its use to new groups, citing precedent after the first use. And this is why this story matters so much. The main issue is that we've already have effective laws to use without invoking wartime authorities. And there is a prediction now coming from me. Just watch and see. The Trump administration is going to use the protests, the judges blocking his agenda, and the misuse of these laws as the very justification on why they need to invoke wartime authority, because they're going to say this is an us versus them misuse of judicial power instead of acknowledging the expansion and misuse of presidential power. Just wait. You're going to see the Trump administration use this as an argument for why they need to continue to have more power. This is just like when President Obama was being blocked by Republicans at every turn trying to shut his agenda down. So he ended up legislating and setting the stage for Trump by doing so much executive orders for trying to get his agenda through, basically cutting out the House and Senate from the process as much as he could. Now, in our closing story, this has to do with direct U.S. involvement in West Asia and the Middle East. Trump orders attacks on militant strikes in Yemen and issues a warning to Iran. Now, we've seen these things before, but I just want us to keep an eye on direct U.S. military involvement in the region because it can lead to dramatic escalation, especially when you pair that with Ukraine announcing that they may now be able to strike Moscow, Russia's capital, with homegrown missile systems they claim to have already successfully used in combat. This move is being justified by Ukraine because President Donald Trump withdrew military aid from the nation, and the country now is working overtime to boost its own domestic weapons production. Now, guys, this is the end of the show for today. I will see you tomorrow on Ramadan Recap, but please do me a favor. Don't forget to subscribe and share. I'm praying for peace and that God blesses you and yours. Take care.